Daniel Mercer had been called many things in Silver Creek, but coward had never been one of them. That was why, when Judge Holloway announced that Daniel would inherit the Mercer ranch only if he honored his late father's final agreement and married Margaret Hale, the entire courthouse expected him to refuse. Instead, Daniel stood beside the older woman in stunned silence while whispers rolled through the room. Margaret was 59, a widow, and the woman most people in town avoided. Her silver-gray hair was gathered in a neat, low bun, and she wore a faded dark green prairie dress beneath a worn brown wool cloak. Daniel was 38, broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair beneath his black Stetson and a neatly trimmed beard. He had returned to Silver Creek only weeks earlier to bury his father. He had not expected to leave the courthouse with a wife. "If this is some kind of joke," Daniel said, staring at the judge, "it isn't funny." Judge Holloway folded his hands. "Your father was very clear." Daniel looked at the sealed document on the desk. "My father could barely explain why he wanted sugar in his coffee during his last month. He explained this." Daniel turned toward Margaret. She had not protested. That bothered him more than the whispers. "Did you know?" Margaret's eyes met his. "I knew there was an agreement. And you were planning to tell me when?" "When I had a choice." The courthouse erupted with laughter from the back benches. Someone muttered that old Margaret had finally found a way to catch a Mercer. Daniel's jaw tightened, but Margaret only lowered her eyes. That silence made him uncomfortable. He had heard the stories since childhood. Her husband, Elias, had vanished under suspicion. Margaret had become isolated, strange and stubborn. Some claimed she had driven Elias away. Others said he had died because of something she knew. Daniel had never cared enough to ask which story was true. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. "The agreement also states that if Mr. Mercer refuses, the ranch and its northern grazing land will be placed into trust until the matter is resolved." Daniel stared at him. The northern grazing land was the most valuable part of the property. Resolved by whom? By the court. Daniel laughed without humor. "So my father arranged for me to marry a woman I barely know, or lose the ranch. That is the plain meaning." Margaret finally spoke. "You can refuse." Daniel looked at her. "Can I?" Her expression remained calm, but something frightened moved behind her eyes. "Yes." "And what happens to you?" She hesitated. Daniel noticed. Judge Holloway answered instead. "Mrs. Hale will lose the cottage provided for her under the same agreement." Daniel turned slowly. "What?" Margaret looked away. Suddenly the laughter in the courthouse sounded uglier. An hour later, Daniel stood beside Margaret before the preacher, still convinced there had to be a mistake. The ceremony was brief. The whispers were not. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, someone laughed again. Daniel felt Margaret flinch beside him. He almost said something, but the chapel door suddenly opened. A man in a grey coat stood outside, watching them. Margaret went pale. Daniel followed her gaze. "Who is that?" "Don't look at him." Too late. The man turned and disappeared into the street. Daniel faced her. "Who was he?" Margaret's fingers tightened around a small brass key hanging beneath her cloak. "We need to leave." "Why?" "Because he knows we got married." Daniel stared at her. "Half the town knows we got married." Margaret whispered, "He knows what the marriage means." Before Daniel could question her, a gunshot shattered the chapel window. Glass rained across the floor. Margaret dropped behind a pew. Daniel reached for his rifle, staring at the brass key in her hand. Suddenly, marriage was the least dangerous secret between them, and the night had only begun. Daniel Mercer had barely pulled Margaret Hale through the rear door of the chapel when another gunshot shattered the night behind them. They ran across the frozen yard toward his wagon, Daniel gripping her wrist while Margaret gathered her worn brown wool cloak with her free hand. Her silver-gray hair remained in its familiar neat low bun, though loose strands whipped across her face, and her faded dark green prairie dress flashed beneath the cloak as she stumbled over the uneven ground. Daniel helped her into the wagon, climbed beside her, and snapped the reins. The horses lunged forward, just as two riders emerged beside the chapel. "They're following us," Margaret said. "I noticed," Daniel replied, driving toward the narrow creek trail instead of the main road. For several minutes, the only sounds were pounding hooves, rattling wheels, and the wind cutting through the trees. Then Margaret reached beneath her cloak and pulled out the small brass key. Daniel glanced at it. "You carried that through your wedding." "I carried it everywhere. What does it open?" Margaret stared at the key. "My husband gave it to me the night before he disappeared." Daniel's hands tightened around the reins. "Elias Hale," she nodded. "He said if anything happened to him, I was never to give it to anyone connected to Silver Creek." Daniel gave a humorless laugh. "Then marrying me was an interesting choice. I didn't choose you. Neither did I." The hoofbeats behind them suddenly faded. Daniel slowed the wagon. Margaret turned sharply. "Why are you stopping?" "Because people don't simply disappear." He listened. Nothing. Then he saw the bridge ahead, or rather, what remained of it. The wooden crossing over the creek had collapsed into the black water below. Daniel pulled the horses back just in time. Margaret stared at the broken supports. Fresh axe marks cut through the beams. "They knew," she whispered. Daniel looked at her. "Knew what?" "Which road we'd take." Before he could answer, a lantern appeared behind them. Daniel reached for his rifle. "Daniel!" a familiar voice called. "It's Sheriff Bell." Margaret seized his sleeve. "Don't answer him." Daniel frowned. "He's the sheriff." "Exactly." Bell called again, saying he had come alone. Margaret's face hardened. "My husband trusted Amos Bell once." Daniel looked at her. "What happened?" 3 days later, Elias vanished. Daniel stared toward the lantern. His father had always respected Bell, but suddenly Daniel wondered whether respect and trust had ever been the same thing. Before he could decide, another rider appeared behind the sheriff and fired. Bell ducked. The bullet struck his horse, sending the animal sideways. Bell fell into the snow. Daniel swore. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Don't go." But Daniel was already climbing down. "If he's lying, I want to hear it from him." He reached Bell behind a boulder as another shot cracked overhead. Blood darkened the sheriff's shoulder. Daniel crouched beside him. "Who is after us?" Bell looked past him toward Margaret. "The people Elias found." "Who?" "Men who have been stealing land for years." Daniel leaned closer. "And my father." Bell's face changed. "Your father tried to stop them." Margaret stepped from the wagon. "Tried," Bell swallowed. "He hid the proof." Daniel grabbed his coat. "Where?" Bell's eyes moved toward the collapsed bridge. "Under there. Your father said the bridge was the only place no one would search. But if Margaret still carried the key, the secret could be opened again tonight somehow." Daniel froze. Margaret clutched the brass key. Then a rifle clicked behind them. Daniel turned slowly. 3 riders stood between them and the wagon. One man had Margaret pinned against its wheel, his weapon pressed against her side. Daniel raised his rifle. "Let her go." The stranger smiled. "Give us the key, Mrs. Hale." Margaret stared at Daniel. The stranger pressed the barrel harder against her. "Or your new husband dies before sunrise." Daniel Mercer kept his rifle raised, but his eyes never left Margaret. She stood beside the wagon, pinned against the wheel by a stranger whose face was hidden beneath a dark hat. Behind Daniel, Sheriff Bell groaned in the snow. Ahead, the creek roared beneath the ruined bridge. "Give it to him," Margaret whispered. Daniel looked at her. "No." The stranger smiled. "That is a poor decision for a man who has been married less than an hour." Daniel's finger tightened near the trigger. "Who are you?" "Someone your father should have killed when he had the chance." Bell suddenly pushed himself upright. "Daniel, don't listen." A shot exploded from the trees. Bell collapsed again, and Daniel fired toward the muzzle flash. The stranger ducked, dragging Margaret with him. She twisted free, struck his arm with the brass key, and ran. Daniel caught her wrist and pulled her behind the wagon as bullets tore through the wooden side. "Can you shoot?" he asked. Margaret stared at him. "I can reload." "That wasn't my question." "Then yes." Daniel handed her the spare revolver. Her hands shook only once before she checked the cylinder. He stared at her. "You have been keeping more than keys from me. You have been asking the wrong questions." Another rider circled toward the creek. Daniel fired, forcing him back. Then Margaret pointed toward the broken bridge. "Your father hid something there." "Bell said that. He didn't tell you what." Daniel looked at her. "Do you know?" Margaret's face changed. Elias did. A bullet struck the wagon above them. Daniel lowered his voice. Start talking. Margaret clutched the key. The night Elias disappeared, he told me your father had discovered a ledger. Names of ranchers, judges, businessmen, even lawmen. They took land by creating debts, changing boundaries, and arranging accidents. Daniel glanced toward Belle, and Belle was on the list. Elias never told me who was guilty. Then why trust him? I don't. That answer stopped Daniel. Margaret looked toward the sheriff. I only know he is afraid. Belle suddenly shouted, "The bridge!" Daniel turned. One of the riders had climbed onto the remaining planks. In his hands was a lantern. Daniel understood immediately. They're going to burn it. He rose to fire, but Margaret grabbed him. Wait! The rider dropped the lantern. Flames spread across the dry supports. Daniel ran before Margaret could stop him. Daniel! He reached the edge just as the first beam cracked. Smoke filled the air. Beneath the bridge, half buried in mud and ice, he saw a small iron door. The brass key flashed in Margaret's hand. She had followed him. Move! Daniel shouted. Not without you! Together, they dropped beneath the bridge, while flames climbed above them. Margaret pushed the key into the iron lock. It turned. Inside was a narrow compartment containing a leather ledger, a folded map, and a sealed envelope bearing Daniel's name. He reached for it, but Margaret grabbed his hand. Listen to me first. The bridge groaned overhead. Elias believed someone inside your family was helping them. Daniel stared at her. My father. He never knew who. And now, Margaret looked at the envelope. Now I think Elias did. A heavy beam crashed into the creek. Water surged around their boots. Daniel tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sentence written in his father's handwriting. If you are reading this, the woman you married knows who betrayed us. Daniel slowly turned toward Margaret. She went pale. I didn't know that was in there. Then a hand reached through the smoke above them and seized the ledger. Daniel lunged, but the figure vanished. A moment later, Margaret screamed. Daniel spun around. She was gone. Only the brass key remained in the freezing water, and from somewhere beyond the burning bridge, a man called, Bring the sheriff, Mercer, or you will never see your wife again. Daniel
had been married to Margaret for only a few hours, yet he was already risking his life to save her. But with every secret revealed, one question became harder to ignore. Was Margaret truly a victim, or had Daniel married into a danger he didn't understand? What would you do in his place? Tell us in the comments, because what Daniel discovers next will change everything.
Mercer stood beneath the burning bridge with freezing water around his boots, staring at the place where Margaret had disappeared. Then Sheriff Bell shouted from the bank, Daniel, they're taking her east. Daniel climbed through the smoke, seized the key, and reached Bell just as another rider vanished between the trees. How many? Daniel demanded. Bell pressed a hand against his bleeding shoulder. 3, maybe 4. Maybe? Daniel grabbed his coat. You were supposed to know these men. Bell's face hardened. I knew enough to stay alive. Daniel raised his rifle. Margaret may not have that luxury. Bell looked toward the road. Neither do you. Daniel turned toward the horses. Then start explaining. They rode hard through the trees, Bell struggling to stay upright while Daniel followed the fresh tracks left in the snow. Bell finally spoke. Your father wasn't one of them. Daniel kept his eyes ahead. Margaret thinks someone in my family betrayed Elias. Someone did. Daniel looked at him. Who? Bell swallowed. Your older brother, Thomas. Daniel pulled his horse sharply to a stop. Thomas is dead. He died because he tried to leave them. Daniel stared at him. What did Thomas do? Bell looked away. He discovered your father had hidden the ledger. The men wanted it. Thomas offered to trade information for his safety. And Elias? Daniel's jaw tightened. Did Thomas have him killed? I don't know. Daniel raised his rifle toward Bell. That answer is getting old. Bell did not move. Then shoot me and find Margaret alone. The words hung between them. Daniel lowered the rifle. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees. They dismounted and moved quietly toward an abandoned sawmill. Through a broken window, Daniel saw Margaret tied to a chair beside a stove. Her silver-gray hair had come loose from its neat low bun, but her faded dark green prairie dress and worn brown wool cloak were unmistakable. A man stood beside her. Daniel recognized him immediately. Thomas Mercer, older than Daniel remembered, thinner, scarred, but alive. Daniel stepped toward the door. Belle caught his arm. "Wait, that's my brother. That's exactly why you should wait." Inside, Thomas placed the stolen ledger on a table. Margaret stared at him. "You took it." Thomas smiled faintly. "I took what should have been mine." Then Margaret spoke. "Daniel's father hid it to protect his family." Thomas leaned closer. "My father hid it to protect Daniel. He was always his favorite." Daniel pushed through the door. "Enough." Thomas stared at him. Then Thomas smiled. "You finally married her." Daniel raised his rifle. "Untie Margaret. You don't understand what she is." Margaret's face hardened. "I'm right here," Thomas laughed. Elias knew the secret was never about the ledger. Daniel looked at Margaret. "What secret?" Thomas reached inside his coat and removed a photograph. It showed Daniel's father, Elias Hale, Sheriff Bell, and Margaret, much younger, standing beside them. Daniel felt the room tilt. "You knew my father?" Margaret closed her eyes. Thomas placed the photograph beside the stove. "Ask your wife why she disappeared from Silver Creek 20 years ago." Margaret looked directly at Daniel. "Because your father told me to." Thomas stepped closer to Margaret. "Tell him the rest." She swallowed. "Your father believed I was the only witness who could identify the men behind the land thefts." Daniel stared at her. "Then why marry me?" Margaret's eyes filled with pain. "Because I didn't know you were his son." Thomas laughed. "And now you know everything." A gunshot shattered the window. Thomas dropped. Bell spun toward the darkness. Men rushed through the rear entrance. Daniel cut Margaret free. But before they could escape, Bell drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Daniel. Margaret went still. Bell's face had changed completely in the lantern glow tonight, utterly. "I'm sorry," he said. "But the ledger has to disappear before dawn, no matter what happens." Daniel Mercer stared down the barrel of Sheriff Bell's gun. Behind him, Margaret stood frozen beside the overturned table, her silver-gray hair disheveled from its familiar neat low bun, her faded dark green prairie dress visible beneath her worn brown wool cloak. Across the room, Thomas Mercer lay wounded near the stove, but he was still alive. Outside, the wind howled against the abandoned sawmill, and more men were moving through the darkness. "Put the rifle down, Daniel," Bell said. Daniel did not move. "You were with them all along." Bell's face tightened. "I was with whoever kept Silver Creek standing." Margaret stepped forward. "You mean whoever kept you in power?" Bell turned the gun toward her, and Daniel immediately moved between them. "Stay behind me." Margaret's voice hardened. "I have spent too many years standing behind men." For the first time, Bell hesitated. Thomas laughed weakly from the floor. "You see, Sheriff, that's always been your problem. You thought fear would keep everyone quiet forever." Bell glanced toward him. "You should have stayed dead." Daniel's eyes moved to his brother. "What does he mean?" Thomas coughed and pushed himself upright against the wall. "Bell arranged my disappearance. I knew too much about the land deals. I wanted out." Margaret stared at him. "And Elias?" Thomas looked away. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "Thomas, I didn't kill him, but you know who did." Thomas slowly lifted his eyes toward Bell. The silence inside the sawmill became unbearable. Margaret closed her eyes, and Daniel finally understood. Sheriff Bell had not merely helped hide the crimes. He had been the man making sure the truth never reached Silver Creek. Bell's finger tightened against the trigger. "You don't understand how much this town depends on me." Daniel slowly lowered his rifle to the floor. Margaret turned sharply toward him. "Daniel, I'm listening." Bell frowned. Daniel took one careful step forward. "You wanted the ledger gone. You wanted Margaret silent. You wanted Thomas buried as a dead man." "Daniel! But there is one thing you forgot." Bell narrowed his eyes. "What?" Daniel smiled without humor. "You never actually got the ledger." Bell's face changed. Margaret understood instantly. The leather ledger lying on the table had been a decoy. The real one was still hidden. Bell grabbed Margaret's arm. "Where is it?" Daniel moved. His fist struck Bell's wrist. The gun fired into the ceiling. Margaret twisted free as Daniel and Bell crashed into the table. Thomas kicked the fallen revolver across the floor toward Margaret. She picked it up. "Don't move." Bell froze. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then voices came from outside. "Sheriff!" Bell looked toward the door. His men had arrived. Daniel grabbed Margaret's hand. Time to go. They escaped through the rear of the sawmill just as gunfire erupted behind them. Daniel helped Margaret onto a waiting horse, and together they rode through the darkness toward the old Hale property. Only when the sawmill disappeared behind them did Margaret finally speak. "You knew the ledger wasn't real." Daniel looked ahead. "I switched it under the bridge." Margaret stared at him. Despite everything, a small smile appeared on her face. For the first time that night, Daniel smiled back. But when they reached the Hale property, that smile disappeared. The old house stood silent beneath the moonlight. Daniel dismounted and walked toward the front door. It was already open. Inside, furniture had been overturned. Drawers had been pulled apart. Someone had been searching for something. Margaret slowly stepped inside beside him. Then she stopped. On the table was the real ledger. Daniel stared at it. He had hidden it beneath the bridge. Margaret whispered, "How did they find it?" Daniel walked closer. Beside the ledger was a folded note. His name was written across the front. Daniel opened it. Inside were only 7 words. "You married her before you knew why." Margaret's face went pale. Daniel looked toward her. "Margaret," she slowly backed away. "There is something I never told you." Daniel felt the cold return to the room. "What?" Margaret looked directly into his eyes. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Elias Hale was never my husband." Daniel stared at her. Before he could speak, horses stopped outside in the snow. The sound was unmistakable. They had been followed. Margaret turned toward the window as a shadow crossed the glass. Daniel reached for his rifle, but Margaret grabbed his arm. "Wait!" He looked at her. "Why?" Her face had lost all color. "Because the man outside is the reason I was forced to marry you." A heavy knock struck the front door. Daniel and Margaret stood completely still. Then a familiar voice came from outside. "Open the door, Daniel." "Thomas Mercer." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "He followed us." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No." Another knock came, harder this time. "Then what?" Margaret looked toward the door. "He was never one of them." Daniel felt the room tighten around him. "What are you saying?" Margaret's eyes filled with fear. "Thomas was the one who arranged the marriage." Daniel stared at her. "Why?" The door shook beneath another blow. Margaret finally looked directly into his eyes. "Because he believed marrying me was the only way to keep me alive." Daniel's hand tightened around the rifle. Outside, Thomas shouted again. "Daniel! Don't let her open that ledger!" Margaret froze. Daniel looked down. The leather ledger on the table was still closed. Slowly, he reached toward it. Margaret grabbed his wrist. "Don't! Why not?" Her voice trembled. "Because that ledger doesn't just expose the men who stole the land." Daniel stared at her. "What else does it expose?" Margaret slowly released his hand. "Who I really am." Daniel stared at Margaret as the words settled between them. "Who I really am." Outside, Thomas pounded on the door again. "Daniel, don't let her open that ledger." Daniel raised his rifle. "Why?" Margaret's face tightened. "Because Thomas thinks the truth will destroy you." "What truth?" The answer came from outside. "Open the door, and I'll tell you." Daniel hesitated, then pulled the door open. Thomas stood alone in the snow, wounded but determined. Before Daniel could speak, Margaret seized the ledger. "You promised me," she said. Thomas looked at her sadly. "I promised to keep you alive." Daniel's eyes moved between them. "Enough. Open it." Margaret slowly untied the leather strap. Inside were the names of every man involved in the land thefts, but beneath them was another document. Daniel recognized his father's handwriting immediately. It was a confession. 20 years earlier, Margaret had witnessed the murder of her parents, who had discovered the same conspiracy. To protect her, Daniel's father gave her a new identity and placed her under Elias Hale's protection. Elias had never been her husband. He was her guardian. When Elias disappeared, Margaret was left alone, carrying the one secret that could destroy everyone involved. Daniel looked at Thomas. "And the marriage?" Thomas lowered his eyes. "The agreement was my father's idea. When Grady's men began searching for Margaret again, marrying you was the only way to place her under Mercer protection without revealing who she was." Margaret's voice broke. I never wanted to lie to you. Daniel looked down at the ledger. Suddenly, the strange marriage, the attacks, and every secret finally made sense. Then Sheriff Bell's voice came from the darkness. Touching. Everyone froze. Bell stepped from the trees with 2 armed men. Now give me the ledger. But this time, Daniel did not hesitate. He raised his rifle as Thomas fired from the doorway. The gunfight was brief. Bell's men fled, and Bell was finally wounded and disarmed. By sunrise, the surviving conspirators were in custody, and the ledger was on its way to federal authorities. Later, Daniel found Margaret standing quietly beside the Mercer ranch. You're free now, he said. Margaret looked toward him. So are you. Daniel smiled. Maybe neither of us was forced into this marriage for the reason we thought. For the first time since that courthouse wedding, Margaret smiled back. And this time, when Daniel reached for her hand, she chose to take it.